Hello my creatures, welcome back to Bound by Words. My name is Madii and today we are going to be talking all about zero drafts. What are they, why might you want to do them, and what do you do when you're done writing a zero draft? But before we do that, the YouTube algorithm has told me that 50% of the people who watch my videos are not subscribed. So if you found yourself on my channel more than once, please hit the subscribe button and support my channel. I would really appreciate it. So let's get into the video. Alright, so first we have to start with what is a zero draft. And I personally think that the best way to think of it is a really rough first draft. So first drafts are rough anyway. I'm a big fan of the saying that the first draft is just you telling yourself the story. But zero drafts sort of take it a step further and have a lot more aspects to it that might make it hard if you put down a zero draft to pick it back up and read it months later if you had forgotten sort of what was going on in your head when you were writing it. And what I mean by this is they might have some bigger technical problems wrong with them. So, for example, I'm going to use my manuscript that I'm writing right now because it is definitely on the more extreme side of a zero draft. So for my current manuscript, I decided I wanted to write in third person at the beginning of the book, but then 10,000 words later, 12,000 words later, maybe even, I decided that there's a lot of stuff that I was missing from not writing it in third person. There was a lot of details and stuff that I wanted to include, and it was sort of like the way my mind was naturally reverting back into. So I did some careful consideration, and then I did some research on point of view, and I switched back to third person. So my current manuscript that I am calling a zero draft has a small portion of it in third person, a large chunk in first person, and then the rest up to what I have written now in third person again. So things like that, big technical differences, I think is what makes a zero draft versus a first draft. So even though a first draft is a really rough telling of the story, usually the first draft is a more cohesive version of the story. If somebody else were to pick up your first draft, they might be able to tell that it's not the best version, and they might be able to tell that it needs some work, but they can still follow the story and follow the characters. So some signs that your manuscript might be a zero draft instead of a first draft is zero drafts might have big technical problems like the point of view problem I described. They might have scenes out of order. They might have an organizational problem that's related to how you are writing the book. So when I say organizational problem, what comes to mind is when you write scenes out of order and don't reorder them to where you intend them to be. I don't mean if you skip scenes, because writing scenes out of order is totally normal, but if you write a scene and then you put like in brackets like insert this scene here and you move on to a different scene and you continue writing, I don't mean that. And if you have a Scrivener document that has all of your scenes separated into separate files and you like label your scenes, how they go, and you jump around and write them as you feel like it, I don't mean that either. What I mean is if you are writing and then as you are writing, you realize like, oh, here's something that I wanted to include maybe 5,000 words ago. And you write it right where you are because you're there and you're ready and you have it in your mind and you write it and you don't go back and reposition it. And the reason I consider things like this to be one of the markers of a zero draft is because if you set your book down and you let it rest after you have completed this zero draft and then you pick it up 2 months later and you start the editing process, are you going to remember where that scene was supposed to go? Is it going to be disorienting for you to try to read and try to figure out things that have bigger sort of structural problems like that? So in my mind, that's what I call the difference between a zero draft or a fast draft and a first draft. So they're both very rough, but when I think of a zero draft, I think of things that have more technical problems with it that might make it confusing to address if you let it sit too long. And something that I think is really important that not a lot of people realize, I know a lot of people have strong feelings about zero drafts and whether or not they are valid, but I think if you are using the term zero draft and you are using that as a label, that you have to understand that it's different not only per person but also per manuscript. Somebody might produce the majority of their work as zero drafts. So even if you write 90%, 95% of all the work you write you consider to be a zero draft because of how rough or maybe even disorganized it is, you really have to judge that by the manuscript. But maybe 5% of what you write comes out and it's in order and the point of view is correct and the protagonist is real and fleshed out and relatable, and it might not be the best version of the story, but it's too strong to be considered a zero draft. So some people, when they go into a project, know like, I'm going to zero draft this, and that basically means I'm going to get all the words down and I'm going to worry about everything else later. And the reason a lot of people like to do this is for writing challenges, writing experiments, and NaNoWriMo events. And honestly, I think if you choose to zero draft and you write a like whole novel and then you look back at it and say, well, you know what? The structure is really sound, the story is really okay, the characters have really nice arcs, then you should start calling it a first draft. It's not really a zero draft anymore. Moral of the story, I don't really think you know if you're writing a zero draft or a first draft until you have a decent part of the manuscript done. Another hint that your manuscript might be a first draft is if you're writing, and as you're writing, you're making notes of things that should have happened earlier that you need to change, or things that did happen that shouldn't have happened. You know, I have like a notebook that I keep next to me whenever I'm writing, and it's a lot of, I have to insert more of this kind of tension or more of this kind of creature in the first couple thousand words. If you're consistently making a lot of notes like that during the manuscript process, then it's probably a sign that your story isn't all figured out yet, and that is totally okay. Ultimately, it doesn't matter which one you go with. Your writing process is your writing process, and everybody is different, and some people really like using zero draft as a method and as a title, and some people are really against it, and either way is totally valid. The zero drafting is sort of like a newer optional title, and I think the main purpose of it is to indicate to fellow writing friends that, hey, my manuscript really isn't figured out yet. That's how I use zero draft. So if you hear me talking about one of my projects as a zero draft, it's probably because I'm still figuring out what's going on. I'm still figuring out subplots, I'm still meeting characters, I'm still repositioning things, stuff like that. Another benefit of writing zero drafts, and another thing you should consider during this process, is maybe editing is your strong suit. Maybe the drafting is your least favorite part and it's just so boring, but you like going through and picking through the story and making it stronger. Maybe that's what you really excel at. In that case, maybe zero drafting is your best bet. You can just hurry up and get all the words down, tell yourself the story, get your thoughts in order, kind of zero drafting, quickly explaining and exploring what your world is, and then go back in later from an editor's point of view and add scenes and rework scenes and move things around. So that is another benefit of a zero draft. So we have talked about what a zero draft is, how it's different from a first draft, and why you might want to use it. Now the big final question is, what do you do when you're done with a zero draft? What do you do when that's all you have is a zero draft and it's a jumbled mess of words and you're trying to figure out the story and nothing's really solidified yet? And this is the most important part. So there are two things you can do with a zero draft. You can let it rest like you would normally do a first draft, and I think every writer will give you this advice. You want to go into the editing stage of your book as a reader. You want to get out of the story a little bit. You want to step away and you want to let yourself forget some of the nitty-gritty details, because as you go back through and read it, you want to be as judgmental as you can on your own work. So the first thing you can do is let it rest like you would normally do, and then come back and revisit and untangle all of the mess of what your zero draft was whenever you're creating your first draft. Or you can do step 2, and that is make it a first draft, but then let it rest. I really don't think the let it rest part is optional. The amount of time you have to let it rest is going to be different for each writer. Maybe it's only a week and then you're totally ready to start editing. That's way too soon for me. I like to let my work rest for at least a month, usually 2. But sometimes with zero drafts, it's important to fix up certain things before you let it rest. And honestly, this is how I kind of like draw the line and decide, is it a zero draft and is it a first draft? If I let my book rest for 2 months and I pick it up, am I as the writer going to be totally confused? Am I going to be frustrated that the point of view changed? Am I going to be frustrated that characters aren't consistent? Am I going to confuse myself because I changed the name of a character halfway through the book? That's kind of where I draw the line of whether or not I'm calling my book a first draft or a zero draft. So option 2 is to make your zero draft a first draft. And whenever I say that, I mean do the edits, the basic technical edits that would make your manuscript more coherent. Now, I don't mean going through and evaluating all these subplots. I don't mean changing your magic system. I don't mean adding words in and really fussing over things that you've already written. What I mean is you go through and you do just the bare minimal, mostly technical changes that will turn your zero draft into a first draft. So my point of view problem, whenever I'm done with this book, I'm going to straighten out the point of view so that it's all written from third person before I let it rest. That way, whenever I pick it up, I can read it as it's a book and I can criticize it as an actual book instead of looking at it and thinking of it as a dumpster fire, basically. Another thing that you can do is you can do all of your organizational work. So I do a lot of my writing in For the Words, which is a writing RPG game that I really love, but I do all of my organization and storage in Scrivener. So in order to get my zero draft a first draft, I have to sort out the scenes that I wrote in this writing RPG, and I have to move them over and break them up and label whose point of view they are in my Scrivener document. So you can see these are kind of very broad stroke things because your first draft is meant to be rough. If you write a coherent story and it's nice and you like it and you think that the characters are good and the magic system's good and you're just going through and you're just fixing paragraphs you don't like, cutting out things that aren't necessary, or like adding some tension, then you're working on a second draft. You're not making it a first draft anymore. So whenever all of your broad stroke things are done, your organizational stuff is done, I personally start considering my manuscripts a first draft then. So I am fast drafting this book, and as I'm fast drafting it, I have all these notes for, I need to go back and add this, I need to go and do this, the story won't be good unless I do that, and I'm going to complete that list of things as I'm writing and as I'm adding to the story, and then if I cross off those items on my to-do list before I finish the first manuscript, then I'm going to have a nice solid first draft. But what I currently have is a zero draft of a long list of words that's just not enough to be a good story on its own. So let me know down below if you have a work in progress that you're working on. Is it a zero draft? Is it a first draft? Is it somewhere in the middle? Are you still figuring it out? Once I go back through and I finish those things on the list, I'm gonna have a story that feels more like a unit than a jumble of like knotted stuff to work out. And that's sort of the goal. That's when I start considering my first draft a first draft, when it's like, here's one thing that from cover to cover makes sense. So if you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and subscribe because I post writing related content every Monday.